Hey guys, another video. Somebody had a really good question, so I decided to make a specific video about it. And as you guys know, I'm traveling to a Drift Week from New York to Texas, and I might as well do this video for you guys. And the video is about what's good and bad about the Corvette, and what's the hype all about. And I think the question was, what's all the hype about the Corvettes? And yeah, that's definitely interesting, really interesting question. So the Corvettes, if we look at the platforms, the C5 and the C6 are very, very similar cars. There's a couple small differences. The rack position on the C5 is better than on the C6. On the C6, the rack position is a little further forward. You can't move the rack because the crank pulley is right next to the rack. And that's a little bit better on the C5. So in the C6, if you run a certain amount of Ackerman and a certain amount of angle, and it's usually a lot of Ackerman effect combined with a lot of angle, so that's not really something you would often drive. It's almost like road car Ackerman setting with 70 degrees of FD lock, which is not a combination that you would run often. But if you run that combination, we advise to run the offset spacers, which is a completely new design. It's nothing like other rack offset spacers, but it's definitely recommended to do that. You'll just have a little more reach in Ackerman. You'll have the same angle without them, just have a little less Ackerman options if you don't run them. So that's the two differences between that chassis. It's mainly the rack position. Of course, you could fit any C6 motor to a C5 and stuff like that. Very, very similar car. So what's so great about them and what's not great about them? It's actually I'll start with what's not great about them. So what's not great about them is the factory electronics and the factory electrics. So it's a sports car, obviously, but it's still just a GM car. So it's not a Porsche or a BMW. It's still a GM. So if you look at all the connectors and all the crimping and all the wires that are used, and like the covers for the wiring and the routing of the wiring and all that stuff, it's just not really high end. So my buddy Chris has a really nice CO6, and he had his taillights failing because the connector was falling apart on the taillights and stuff like that. So that's obviously really, really silly. All the problems that we've seen with them on Drift Week are also often electronics related. So bad grounds and stuff, modules, and all kinds of weird things happening, CAN bus problems. If you don't know what CAN bus is, look it up. It would be too much of a video to do that. Basically means that wires are used for multiple things. So it's not like if you have an old car, if you see a light come on, it means that there's one wire with a plus and there's a ground, and that's just controls that one light. With a CAN bus system, basically the wires do different things. It's not one wire for one thing, it's one wire for multiple things. So that definitely can give you a lot of trouble. And of course that's not what you want on a drifting day. It's going to eat into your seat time. So that's one really bad thing. Another bad thing that not a lot of people talk about, or maybe I'm 6'4", but everybody knows the seating position isn't the easiest with a cage. You need to put a really good cage in there. But that's not really a problem. If you build a really good cage, I mean, that's it. But it's the same as an ash chassis. If an ash chassis has a shitty cage or a stupid fabrication of the cage, you can't really sit in those either. So they're sports cars. They're two-door sports coupes. So it's just normal. If you build a 911 or a Cayman, it's also very difficult to get the cage in a way that you can sit in it if you're a tall guy with a helmet. So definitely not the easiest thing to do. Putting a cage in a car, definitely not the most interior space, but it's a coupe. Like, people are comparing it to an E46 or whatever. Obviously doesn't make any sense. Like, it's a sports car. So yeah, the thing that I do want to point out as a negative thing is the visibility in the car. So you're sitting in the car, and it's definitely the way I see out of my E46 is definitely not there on the Corvettes. the windscreen is on a different rig. Obviously, the A-pillar and everything is much closer to your head, so there's definitely a big difference there. And I would call that like a disadvantage, because I can tell when I drove the cars, the Corvettes that I drove, it was definitely much more difficult, like in battles and stuff, to see the other car. And when I went back from a Corvette into my E46, I was like, man, I'm in a fish tank or something. There's so much visibility. So that's a negative side of it. Another negative side of the car, like the packaging isn't the easiest with everything. So because it's a sports car with very large frame rails, those frame rails are right next to the motor, and it's an actual frame, so it's not like an S chassis that has like inner fenders. Like Corvette doesn't really have inner fenders; they have like some kind of plastic liners, but it's not really an inner fender. So if you're building a pro car, you need to put all the stuff that contains oil within the frame rails. That was a problem that we had at the FD car. So you need to put your AccuSump and your breathers and all that stuff inside the frame rails. And it's very, very narrow because the frame rails are right next to the motor and they're pretty high up, like they're almost at the level of the headers, where the S chassis frame rails are way lower. And S chassis, like, you can just put like, it's just, S chassis also doesn't have a lot of room. It's maybe not the best example, but like an E46 is way easier to put all those things in a Corvette. The motor is really close to the bulkheads, difficult to get the fuel lines in, more difficult to route the fuel lines, so we had to notch the wiper assembly, watch the FD car build videos that's on this channel. So it's definitely, the packaging of that car isn't the easiest. In the back also, obviously you have the exhaust going over the drive shafts from the factory, and that's not really something you want in a drift car, especially if you build them like a pro car. You're going to be running a quick change. We have the perfect solution for the quick change, like the upside down setup that we have in the FD car, which is all billet, and you don't have to do anything on the subframe. You don't have to notch it or cut huge pieces out of it, like some of these kits for quick changes are just like you have to cut a lot out of the subframe and put some kind of brace under it. It doesn't make much sense. So we just have the upside down kit, run the quick change upside down, which also has a great angle of the drive shaft. Our drive shaft is on 3.5 degrees or something, so that's perfect. So if you run the combination of transmission up front and quick change in the back, definitely run that solution with the upside down setup, which is also adjustable, so you can set up the rake and everything. So definitely a good thing. However, I would not run exhausts over these drive shafts, because it's just more difficult to service a drive shaft. Obviously, it's going to be a lot of heat in the differential and in the drive shafts in the CV joints. So you want to do something else with those exhausts. Not the easiest thing. We made a boom tube on the Corvette, which is basically an 1.5 inch high, almost like a big letterbox, like a big flat piece of exhaust, like a NASCAR exhaust that goes all the way under the subframe, because the subframe extends. Basically, if you look between the rear wheels, there's no high point in the car where you could route an exhaust. Everything is like flat as a pancake with the subframe and the control arms and everything. So it's not really easy. That's obviously why they do that from the factory. So the packaging on that is definitely difficult for the exhaust, so you need to come up with something like that. The original tank situation, they're beautifully situated right behind the driver and the passenger seat. But there's a lot of cars catching on fire. There's a lot of stuff going on with guys putting aftermarket stuff on those cars, and it's just difficult because the floor is also completely flat. So on an S chassis or an E46, you can run like the lines through all kinds of cavities that are in the car's floor, but the Corvette, you just can't do it. So it all has to go through the transmission tunnel, which obviously isn't ideal, because you have your drive shaft over there, you have the transmission there and a linkage. You have the exhaust over there, you have an X pipe over there, so it's a lot of heat generated over there. So it's definitely, packaging wise, it's not the easiest car. The interior of the car is obviously cramped, so it's one of those things. It's not the easiest car for cycling around with all the stuff that you need to put in a pro car. Obviously, these days you have a cool suit as well and all that stuff, so you just need to cut out the trunk floor and all those things. And also, what I do like about them is what we're going to be talking next. And what I do like about them is everything that's about the chassis dynamics. Like, the car is such an eye-opener.
Don't forget to take a look at our website as well, einzel.nl. We ship worldwide, of course, Wisefab, Feal Suspension, our own brand Einzel, gearboxes, quick change differentials, axles, all kinds of things. A lot of fabrication components, of course, air jacks, subframes for quick change, you name it. Drop us an email and we'll hook you up.
It's an incredibly easy car to drive. It's probably, I think that the FD car that we built is one of the easiest drift cars I've ever driven in my life. It's very, very intuitive. With the Wisefab kit, it's so much angle. I drove all the other big angle kits, all the other big selling angle kits, and they really drive completely differently. There's many of them have like a dead feeling in the center, so if you're steering 10 degrees to the left and 10 degrees to the right, you don't really feel where your wheels are at, so the center section feels very vague, but then it flops to lock like crazy if you're going over 30 or 40 degrees, so you're almost like really gripping the steering wheel to make it stay, because otherwise it wants to pull out of your hand. And I had guys try to change that, set up a caster camber, tow, all those things, but it's just part of the geometry of those angle kits. The Corvette is such a good and rigid chassis, and it has such a low center of gravity and such great weight balance that if you have an angle kit that's not the correct geometry, it's going to be amplified by the chassis. So what these Corvettes all have a lot of forward bite, and the forward bite almost eats into the side bite. So I won't say they don't have side bite, but compared to the forward bite, they don't have a lot of side bite. So it's a little difficult to understand maybe, but the car basically wants to go in the direction of the rear wheels more than it wants to go in the direction of the front wheels. So you need a really good angle kit to funnel that forward bite into side bite, and that's what the Wisefab kit's doing really well. The Ackerman curve and all the geometry works really, really well for that. So when I drove even a prototype Wisefab kit in California, I was like, man, this is incredible. It's such a different car. Richard Advani, who drove a lot, drifted a lot with different angle kits on the Corvette, he drove and he's like, I didn't even know this was possible. It's like an entirely different car. So we're really proud of that, and I think that's an amazing angle kit. And for me, it's definitely the first thing I would put on a Corvette, because we also have the kit that uses the original arms. It makes the car less wide. It still gives you a lot of angle. It's have a lot of less adjustability, of course, but you use the original arms. So if you have baller wheels or you want to keep the front end of the car, like the front fenders and everything, then you can run that. And you can upgrade it to the Pro Kit altogether. Is exactly the same knuckle. It's just we provide a piece with it that you press into the OEM knuckle. So that's definitely, yeah, for me it was an eye-opener. It really put an exclamation mark on how good that chassis is. Like I said before, the center of gravity is really, really good in that car. It's very low center of gravity, and that improves everything. That improves your anti-squat, that improves your roll, your pitch, your anti-dive, everything. Also, the weight distribution is great. The engine, it's a mid-engine car, so the engine sits behind the front axle. And all that stuff just puts it in a different league than other cars. I just feel that it still needs a little development, and obviously that's what we're doing with the FD car. We learned a lot from 2022, and we're all applying that to the 2023 car. We're going to be coming out with a bunch of new products for the Corvette. So yeah, that's definitely one part of the equation. It will require some development, but the potential of that car is crazy. What's also nice about them is, like I said in another video, the structural rigidity is very, very high. And for FD cars, that makes a lot of sense. It's super important because you can't reinforce the cars as much. So if the chassis is really rigid, it's giving you a lot of advantage because you're not allowed to put a lot of extra bracing and extra stuff in those cars. So the more rigid the chassis is from the factory, the better. It's not a really easy car to strip. It takes a lot of time to strip them down because a lot of the panels are bonded, like the steel panels and stuff. But once they are stripped, it's a pretty easy car to build. It's obviously also not the most difficult car to get parts for, because a lot of them are crashed or salvaged or whatever. So that's just, I think it really is the next generation of drift cars. People say like, oh, it's an S16 or it's the successor of the S chassis. I don't really, if they mean that it's a popular drift chassis, I agree, but it doesn't share anything with the S chassis whatsoever. I mean, it's a V8, it's a front rack, it's a double wishbone car. It has absolutely nothing to do with an S chassis whatsoever. So I don't know why people call it an S16, but also S chassis are known for their side bite. So I mean, well, in a certain way, like obviously to get a lot of side bite out of them on a pro level, it's a different thing. But like just a standard S chassis out of the box, a great drift car has a lot of side bite for a standard car. So yeah, so it's not really anything to do with an S chassis for you guys calling it S16s or whatever. So yeah, so that's a couple things. I don't know how you guys feel about it. Feel free to, of course, discuss that. If you go over the car, it's definitely not the, for a grassroots or drift week car. I think it needs a lot of small changes because the torque tube obviously is there from the factory. It's not the easiest to work on, and there's obviously guys say, yeah, I got it on the floor in a couple hours and I got it back on. I know, but still, it's a lot more work than just pulling a transmission. And if you break a throw-up bearing or something with the clutch or a seal or any parts in the torque tube, then it's just a lot of work and it's a lot of hassle. I don't know if there's a lot of plug-and-play solutions to improve the torque tubes. So yeah, for a drift week car, I've seen a lot of guys with the standard Corvettes, like I said before, having the electronics as a problem. So on the white Corvette that I want to be building for drift week for myself, I'm definitely putting a Holy Terminator on that car and yeah, making sure that it will always run. So there may be some electronic problems with it that may not work. Maybe the windows don't go up or whatever. And obviously it has yeah, the GM weakness of the cheap electronics that you can see in their trucks as well, or connectors coming apart and whatever. So if you build it as a full pro car, you don't have that problem anymore. But like as a grassroots car, semi-road legal car, it's definitely a thing to look at, the electronics of that car. It's not really much you can do to prevent it. Just make sure that all your grounds are clean and correct and tightened correctly. So yeah, and apart from that, also keep an eye on things like the shock absorbers. I see a lot of guys buying secondhand shocks, and they're set up for road racing because a lot of the shocks like FOD and all those brands. Richard had FOD shocks on the car when I drove it for the first time, and it was like we had it on full soft. And it was still incredibly hard, and the car it just left a lot of grip on the table. We went with the Feal Suspension, and that's like we never gripped that car up at all in FD. The guy's coming up to me in FD saying like, "Hey, Wout, maybe you should free the car up. Like you guys are so gripped up with that car." And I'm like, "Dude, we're 14 clicks from hard. We've got a long way to go with that car. We can still grip it up much, much more. It just has a lot of mechanical grip." And yeah, so that's also the way you drive them. You drive them a little bit different than a BMW or an S chassis, and you definitely, yeah, just make sure that you get the good stuff on there. If you have the wrong angle kit on that car, I don't think it's fun to drive anymore. I drove Max's car on E-Town with a different brand angle kit, and I was like, man, how do people even drive this kit? It was so ham-fisted, like you were so much on your toes the whole time. You were in the middle of a corner, and then the back end would just start coming around. It's super unpredictable, very, very vague center. You had no idea where your front wheels were, super floppy. So yeah, it's definitely, yeah, like I said, it's a good chassis, so it amplifies all the problems that the angle kits have. Yeah, so that's my 2 cents on the Corvette. Let me know below how you guys feel about it.